Your Heritage by Bertrand L. Comparet. Introduction. Much is heard in this day of the word anti-Semitic. The word is a creation of the modern Pharisees, who are anti-Christian. The purpose of the creation was to smear or blacken the name or reputation of Christians seeking to protect and defend their faith from the onslaughts of those who would destroy it. The word Semitic is derived from the patriarch Shem and is correctly applied to people descendant from him. All true Israelites, not Jews as this booklet shows, are therefore Semites. And today, these are the great white Christian nations of the Western world. The Jews, as the second half of this booklet shows, are not Semitic at all, as their Canaanite and Khazar ancestors were not descendants of Shem. Their smear accusation, anti-Semitic, against all who oppose Jewish seizure of Palestine is therefore false. Indeed, the Arabs, who are half-Semitic, can truthfully accuse the Jews of anti-Semitism. The fact is quite obvious. It has been said that communism seeks to make black white and white black. The word anti-Semitic is just one example of such misuse and intended opposite meaning, in an effort to attach an ill-sounding term which should be self-applied to him or them who are actually quite the opposite in viewpoint. It is one purpose of this booklet to bring the reader accurate biblical and historic proof of the error applied in the use of the term anti-Semitic. It is hoped that much confusion, purposely created as camouflage, will be clarified in the minds of Christians by the careful reading and study of the material so excellently presented by the author. Israel's fingerprints. The Bible is written about and addressed to God's people, Israel. It is the history of their past, the prophecy of their future, the law of their relation to their God, and the promise of God's eternal care of them. The common misconception that the Jews are Israel, or all that remains of them, has made the Bible meaningless, and most of it apparently false to those who hold this mistaken belief. It is just as though you took a good history of the United States, but wherever the name United States appeared therein, you erased it and wrote China in its place. As a history of China, it would obviously be false, but if you applied it to the right nation, it would clearly be true. The Bible's history of Israel's past is known to be accurate, and its prophecies of Israel's future have been fulfilled in every detail down to the present day. When the police have the fingerprints of a wanted man, they know that the man whose fingerprints match those they have is the man they seek. Likewise, when we find the people to whom God has fulfilled all of his promises and prophecies to Israel, we have found Israel. Today, the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and the Germanic nations have Israel's fingerprints in every detail. When we realize that we are Israel, the Bible becomes full of meaning for us. It is our history. It contains God's promises to us. It gives us courage to face the terrible upheaval into which all the world is being drawn. If you will only read the Bible with an open mind, taking no man's word for it, but proving for yourself what the Bible says, then comparing that with what you know of present-day history, you will see that we are God's people Israel, and that, however terrible the trial ahead, we will be brought safely through it when we turn to God. First, let us briefly review the ancient history of Israel. God first made his promises of wonderful blessings to Abram, changing his name to Abraham, meaning father of nations. Note that this is in the plural, nations. God repeated his promises to Abraham's son Isaac, and again to Isaac's son Jacob, whose name God changed to Israel, which means he will rule with God. Israel had 12 sons. The descendants of each son became in time a tribe under its ancestor's name. Thus, all the descendants of Dan became the tribe of Dan. All the descendants of Benjamin became the tribe of Benjamin, etc. For many centuries, all members of all the 12 tribes collectively were known as the children, that is, descendants of Israel. However, do not confuse this with the later house or kingdom of Israel, about which I will have more to say later. Israel and his 12 sons, with their families, went into Egypt, as you will remember, and after about 2.5 centuries, their descendants left Egypt in the Exodus under the leadership of Moses. For several generations, they were ruled by judges appointed by God. Later, they unwisely copied the customs of the surrounding nations and demanded a king. So Saul became their first king, ruling the 12 tribes as a single nation. This unified nation of 12 tribes, like the United States of 50 states, continued until the death of Solomon in 975 BC, when it broke into two nations, Israel and Judah. 1 Kings 11:12 tell us how Solomon finally fell into idolatry, misgoverned the people, and burdened them with excessive taxes. When his son Rehoboam succeeded Solomon as king in 975 BC, the weary people petitioned him to ease their burdens, but being vain and arrogant, and surrounded by a lot of quote-unquote bright young Jewish advisors, he threatened to make their load heavier. The exasperated people of the 10 northern tribes revolted and set up their own independent kingdom under Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which is told in detail in 1 Kings chapter 11 and 12 and 2 Chronicles 10 and 11. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, had left in his kingdom only the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, with some of the Levites, who were priests, and this southern kingdom was never thereafter known as Israel, but only as the house or kingdom of Judah. The northern 10-tribed kingdom was thereafter called the house or kingdom of Israel, just as the southern kingdom, Judah, took its name from the tribe of Judah, which was the ruling tribe. So also the northern kingdom of Israel was sometimes called Ephraim in the prophecies, because the tribe of Ephraim was the most powerful tribe in it. The histories and destinies of the two kingdoms were thereafter separate. They engaged separately in foreign wars and treaties, and were sometimes at war with each other, as the Book of Kings and Chronicles record. From the time of this separation, 975 BC, the Bible became very carefully distinguished between the southern 2-tribed nation of Judah and the northern 10-tribed nation of Israel. This distinction is kept clear both in the historical record of what is past and the prophetic record of what is to come. It would take another volume to cover them all, but for a few examples, see the following. The distinction is made historically in the 2 Samuel 19 to 40-43, 1 Kings 14 to 19-21, and 15 to 1-33, and 16b. 2 Kings 3 to 1-9, 2 Chronicles 16 to 1, and 25 to 5-10, and many others. The distinction is kept clear in prophecies in Isaiah 7 to 1, 9, and 11 to 12, 13, Jeremiah 3 to 6, 18, and 5 to 11, and 5 to 10, 17, and 13 to 11, and 18 to 1, 6, and 19 to 1, 13. Ezekiel 37 to 16, 22, Daniel 9 to 7, Hosea 1 to 11, and 4 to 15, and 5 to 9, 15, Amos 1 to 1, Micah 1 to 5, Zechariah 8 to 13, and 10 to 6, 8, and many others. Just as we must carefully distinguish between the two nations of Israel and Judah, so also we must carefully distinguish between the nation of Judah and the Jews. Both Israel and Judah were carried into captivity, but separately and at different times by different conquerors, and taken to different places. Israel was conquered by Assyria between 740 and 721 BC, and by 715 BC. All of its people had been deported and resettled in what we now know as Armenia, northwestern Iran, and the region near Baku, around the southern end of the Caspian Sea. The Assyrians brought in other people and settled them in Samaria, the southern half of Israel's old Palestinian land, to which the people of Israel never returned. See 2 Kings 17. From this time onward, the historical parts of the quote-unquote authorized or King James Version of the Bible do not record the further history of Israel, but in the Apocryph 2 Esdras 13 to 39:46 records their further journey to Ar-Sereth, the valley of the river Sereth, a northern tributary of the Danube River in modern Romania, which still bears the name Sereth. At the conclusion of this deportation of Israel from its Palestinian home, the Assyrian king Sennacherib also invaded the southern kingdom of Judah and captured all the smaller cities in it, everything except Jerusalem. The people of these smaller cities were deported, along with the people of the northern kingdom of Israel. Sennacherib's own record of this invasion says that he deported 200,150 people from the southern kingdom of Judah. 2 Kings 18 to 13 and Isaiah 36 to 1 mention his capture of these cities. Thus, the Assyrian deportation of Israel included the entire population of the northern kingdom of Israel and a considerable representative share of the southern kingdom of Judah. From this time on, these people became the so-called Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. As we shall see, God took care of them, as Lai had promised, and you who are reading this are among their descendants. The kingdom of Judah, on the other hand, did not go into captivity until 606 to 585 BC, and was conquered by Babylon, not Assyria. They were deported to the city of Babylon and settled nearby, a little south of Baghdad, in what is now southern Iraq. Not quite all of them were deported, a few of the poor being left behind to cultivate the land, and no other people were brought in to settle the land. See 2 Kings 24:25. This Babylonian captivity of Judah lasted 70 years and had been prophesied by Jeremiah 20 to 4, 5, and 25 to 11, 12, and 29 to 10. After the fall of Babylon, King Cyrus allowed all who wished to return to Palestine, beginning in 536 BC. See 2 Chronicles 36 to 20, 23. Ezra 1-2 records that only 42,360 returned, and their descendants, who have never been called Jews until their Babylonian conquerors gave them that name, lived in Palestine until the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans under Titius in AD 70. This reconstructed nation, sometimes called Jewish, was the 70 Weeks nation, with the evil destiny to finish the transgression prophesied in Daniel 9-24. In AD 70, those who had survived the terrible wars ceased to be a nation at all and became scattered wanderers in all lands. There is not one word in either the Bible or secular history to suggest that Israel either was destroyed or that they went down to Babylon and joined Judah in the Babylonian captivity, and the Jews themselves testify that the genealogy of those who returned from Babylon shows no one from any tribe but Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, the members of the kingdom of Judah. To the contrary, it was well known at the beginning of the Christian era that Israel then existed in great numbers. Josephus' great history, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 5, speaks of them as an immense multitude beyond the Euphrates River. The prophetic parts of the Bible still continue to prophesy the great future of Israel several generations after they had vanished into the Assyrian captivity. Isaiah prophesied until 698 BC, Jeremiah until 588 BC, Ezekiel until 574 BC, and Daniel to 534 BC. Jesus Christ was well aware of the existence of Israel, separate and apart from Judah and the Jews. See Matthew 10-5-6. Again, compare John 7-35 and 11-49-52, which cannot refer to Judah or the Jews, as the Jews were not yet dispersed or scattered abroad, and would not be for another 40 years. Only Israel was dispersed out of its own land. The complete and permanent destruction of the Jewish nation by the Romans under Titius and their subsequent troubles as outcasts in every land are not a failure of the prophecies and promises to Israel, but an accurate fulfillment of the prophecies about the Jews. With the history of these nations in mind, let us examine God's promises and prophecies about Israel in the Bible. God's promises to Abraham were unconditional. God must fulfill them or break his word. Consider what God said in Genesis 12-2 and 13-16 and 15-5 and 17-3-7 and 19 and 22-16-18. Quote, "And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. So then, if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed be also numbered. As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generations, for an everlasting covenant. Look now toward heaven, and count the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies." Unquote. God did not say that he would do this if or perhaps. These were all unconditional promises. These promises which were made at Mount Sinai on condition that men should obey God's laws were the promises made through Moses relating to health, prosperity, peace, etc. The promises to Abraham were unconditional and absolute, and in the New Testament, Paul tells that the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promises of non-effect. Galatians 3-17. If the Bible is true, if God's word is good, then these promises must be good. God repeated these promises unconditionally to Isaac in Genesis 26-3-5. Quote, "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and I will bless thee, for unto thee and thy seed I will give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swore unto Abraham thy father. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and I will give unto thy seed all of these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." Unquote. Again, in the 28th and the 35th chapters of Genesis, God repeated his promises unconditionally to Jacob, Israel, our ancestor. Quote, "I am the Lord of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac, the land wherein thou liest. To thee I will give it, and to thy seed, and thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth. And thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins." Unquote. There can't be any evasion of these promises, and God has always honored them. Even when the children of Israel worshipped the golden calf while Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments, God did not destroy them for the sake of these promises. See Exodus 32-7-14. In many places, the New Testament recognized these promises as being still in full effect. For example, in Hebrews 6-13 and 17, "For when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself, wherein God, being willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it with an oath." Again in Romans 11-1-2 and 9-4-5 and 15-8, Paul tells us, quote, "I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid, for I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption, and the glory, and the covenants, and the giving of the law, and the service of God, and the promises. Whose are the fathers, and of whom, as concerning the flesh, Christ? Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers." Unquote. So these are the promises of God. If they are false, then the Bible is false. But if they have been fulfilled, then the people to whom they were fulfilled are thereby identified as Israel. But the separate and very different prophecies relating to the Jews show that the promises and prophecies to Israel had no reference to the Jews. Let's look at the few of them. Israel was to have a change of name, while the Jews' name was left to them as a curse. In Isaiah 65-13-15, God tells the Jews, quote, "And ye shall leave your name for a curse to my chosen, for the Lord God shall slay thee, and call his servants by another name." Unquote. Who are God's servants? In many places, God repeats this, quote, But thou, Israel, art my servant, thou art my servant. I have chosen thee, and not cast thee away. Unquote. For example, see Isaiah 41 to 8:10 and 43 to 1 and 10 and 41 to 1 2 and 21 to 22, etc. This has been fulfilled. Israel is no longer called by its old name, but the Jews have retained their name for a reproach and a proverb, a taunt and a curse, as Jeremiah 24 to 9 says. Again, the Jews were to be known by their faces. Isaiah 3 to 9 says, quote, "The show of their countenance doth witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom, they hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves." Unquote. To this day, the Jew is known by his face, and even getting his nose bobbed can't always hide it. It is a witness against him, while Israel is not so marked. Israel was to become a great nation, and also a company of nations, and to be a nation forever, and to have a king forever. See Genesis 35 to 11, Jeremiah 31 to 35, 37, and 33 to 17, Psalm 89 to 3, 4, Isaiah 9 to 7, Luke 1 to 32, 33, which say, quote, "A nation and a company of nation shall be of thee, thus said the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night. If those ordinances depart from before me, said the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus said the Lord, David shall never lack a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel." Unquote. Since the sun, moon, and stars still shine, these promises must be still in effect, and they cannot possibly apply to the Jews who never were, quote, "a company of nations," unquote, and who ceased to be a nation at all in AD 70. On the other hand, Israel has fulfilled all of this, as we shall see. God said that the Jews were to be destroyed as a nation, and to become scattered outcasts in all lands. In the 18th chapter of Jeremiah, God used the parable of the potter making a clay bottle on the potter's wheel, and on the first trial the bottle was spoiled, so the potter mashed it back into a lump and tried again, and on the second trial he made a perfect bottle. God said that he would remake Israel into a kind of nation he wanted, just as the potter had done with the soft clay. But in the next chapter, Jeremiah 19, God told the prophet to get an earthen bottle which had been burned hard, and to assemble the elders and important men of Jerusalem. Then God said, "Then shalt thou break the bottle in the sight of the men that go with thee, and shalt say to them, Thus said the Lord of hosts, Even so I will break this people and this city, as one breaketh a potter's vessel that cannot be made whole again." Again in Jeremiah 15 to 4 and 24 to 29, God said of the Jews, "And I will cause them to be removed into all the kingdoms of earth, because of Mansech, the son of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, for that which he did in Jerusalem. And I will deliver them to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth for their hurt, to be a reproach and a proverb, a taunt and a curse, in all the places whither I shall drive them." In fulfillment of this, after the 70 weeks, or 490 years, of Daniel 9 to 24, were completed, Titus, the Roman general, destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. The Jews were broken as a nation, and have had no king of their own. In John 19 to 15, they spoke truly, "We have no king but Caesar." Israel was to become a very numerous people, besides the many statements of this in Genesis chapters 13, 15, 22, 26, and 28, it is repeated in Hosea 1 to 10. Quote, "Yet the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. The Jews, on the other hand, were reduced to a remnant." In Ezekiel 5 to 11, 12, God said, quote, "Wherefore, as I live, said the Lord God, surely because thou hast defiled my sanctuary with all thy detestable things and with all thine abominations, therefore I will also diminish thee, neither shall mine eyes spare, neither will I have pity. A third part of thee shall die with the pestilence, and with famine shall they be consumed in the midst of thee, and the third shall fall by the sword round about thee, and I will scatter a third into all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them." Unquote. See also Jeremiah 15 to 4:9, etc. The total Jewish population of the world is estimated to be about 16 million people today, almost exactly what it was estimated to be just before Hitler's completely
illegal to question
massacre of 6
Gorillion,
jabroni who were not
showered
at all. They are not so prolific that in 20 years they could increase their numbers by 60%, as would have to be the case if the alleged
roller coaster
was true. To conceal this fact, the jabroni now seek to falsify the records. You will remember that in our 1960 census, it was not permitted to ask anyone his religion, so you couldn't find out that 5 million of the supposedly dead 6
Gorillion
had been illegally admitted to the United States. But this 16 million is certainly not as the stars of tile heaven or the sand which is upon the seashore for numbers. For another thing, Israel was to become blind to its identity. In Romans 11 to 25, Paul comments that blindness in part is happened to Israel. This is fulfillment of Isaiah 42 to 19:20. "Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger that I sent? Seeing many things, but thou observest not, opening the ears, but thou heardest not." You remember that God's servant is Israel. The Jews, on the other hand, are not blind to their identity. They know their origin and their history, although they try to fool you into thinking that they are Israel. And they generally have succeeded in this deception. Again, Israel was to receive the new covenant, Christianity. Jeremiah 31 to 33 prophesized it, and in Hebrews 8 to 10, Paul quotes it in proof of this, quote, "But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, said the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Unquote. Have the Jews received the new covenant? Of course not. As the beloved apostle John said in 1 John 2 to 23, quote, "Whosoever denieth the Son, the same hath not the Father." Unquote. And in John 15 to 23, Jesus Christ himself said, quote, "He that hateth me hateth my Father also." Unquote. The Jews do not fulfill any of the principal prophecies concerning Israel. Therefore, the Jews are not Israel. Does Israel exist today, or has God violated all of his promises? Yes, Israel exists today, for the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Germanic peoples have received the fulfillment of God's promises and prophecies. First, they are a great nation and a company of nations, all of the same race. The United States is the largest civilized nation in the world. Its population is exceeded only by China, India, and Russia. It is the richest, most advanced, most benevolent in its policies, and has the greatest degree of liberty of any large nation. Between the two world wars, the former British Empire was officially recognized into the British Commonwealth of Nations. Canada and Austria are independent nations. The Scandinavian and the Germanic nations are of the same blood, have largely same customs and can be identified historically as the peoples who furnished most of the population of the British Isles and its colonies in the United States. Second, they are very numerous, as the prophecies said Israel would be. In the last 2 centuries, the population of the United States has increased from a mere handful to over 200 million, of whom about 150 million are white Christians of Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, Germanic stock. In the last 3 centuries, the population of the British Isles and their colonies of Canada and Australia increased from about 5 million to over 70 million Anglo-Saxons. The nations of Germany, Austria, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland add about 96 million more. So the total of the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, Germanic peoples is well over 300 million. Third, they are a maritime people, of the descendants of Israel. Numbers 24-7 prophecies, quote, "His seed shall be in many waters," unquote. And Psalm 89-25 says, quote, "I will set his hand also in the sea, and his right hand in the rivers," unquote. The world's greatest navies are those of the United States and Britain. The greatest merchant marine fleets are those of Britain and Norway. Fourth, they are the greatest military powers. Jeremiah 51-20 gives God's word, quote, "Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war, for with thee I will break in pieces the nations, and with thee I will destroy kingdoms," unquote. Throughout history, this has been true. A century after being taken captive by Assyria, the people of Israel, then generally known as Scythians, had bled Assyria white by their constant warfare against it, so that Assyria was an easy pushover victory for the Medes and the Persians just before they turned their attention to Babylon. It was the Israel tribes on their march to Europe as the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals who crushed the Roman Empire. In 713 at Tours, Anglo-Saxon Israel destroyed the invading hordes of Muslims, Jews, and Moors. In the 13th century, they defeated the Tatar, Mongol, Jewish Khazar hordes under the Genghis Khan. Later, they conquered Turkey and Japan, not without heavy cost, for the promises of easy victory were made through Moses and were conditional upon keeping the law. But the promise of final victory to shatter the enemy, even with heavy cost, is unconditional. This has been fulfilled consistently to only one people, those whom we identify as Anglo-Saxon Israel. Fifth, they possess the gates of their enemies. You will remember that this was one of God's promises we found in Genesis 22:17. Obviously, this doesn't mean a wooden gate in some person's front yard, but the gateways of hostile nations, the great waterways of the world. Consider the fact that the Anglo-Saxon nations, and they alone, have the power to close every important water gate in the world. American and British fleets based at Scotland, the Orkney Islands, Gibraltar, Malta, Aden, Cape Town, Australia, Singapore, the Philippines, Hawaii, San Francisco and Puget Sound, Panama, the Falkland Islands, Hampton Roads, and Iceland. These dominate and can close the Skagerrak and Baltic Sea, the North Sea, the English Channel, the Straits of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, the Indian Ocean, the waters around Southeast Asia and the coast of Asia, the coasts of Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope, the coasts of the North and South America, the Straits of the Magellan and around Cape Horn, and all the trade routes across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. They have proved this by actually doing it in 2 world wars. Sixth, They possess the desolate heritages of the earth. In Isaiah 49:8, God says, quote, "Thus said the Lord, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in the day of salvation have I helped thee. And I will preserve thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages." Unquote. No one else has so successfully developed the colonies which were desolate when they first occupied them. Compare what the United States has done in the southwestern states with Mexico, similar land with fully as great undeveloped riches, separated from us by only an imaginary line. Compare British Africa with the African colonies of all other nations, and especially compare it with the dismal savagery of the Negroes. Compare the development of Palestine and Iraq while under British rule with Turkey, Arabia, Iran, etc. Seventh, they have expanded in colonies in all directions. Deuteronomy 32:8 says, "When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of children of Israel." Genesis 28:14 says, "Thou shalt spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in thee, in thy seed, shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Isaiah 54:2-3 tells us, "Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of habitation. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes, for thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the nations, and make the desolate cities to be inhabited." Their colonies were established in every sea, in Europe, North and South America, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Asia. Who else has ever had such colonies? All the ancient empires were insignificant compared to these. Since we have allowed the Jews to teach us to turn our backs on God, we have unwisely abandoned our colonies, and the chaos in the world today is largely a result of our failure to obey God's commands to occupy and rule the uncivilized peoples. However, even this was also prophetic, though that is another subject. Eighth, they have maintained the continuity of the throne of David. David's descendants continued on the throne in Jerusalem until King Zedekiah was taken prisoner to Babylon, at which time all his sons were slain. But the prophet Jeremiah took the king's daughters first to Egypt, as we read in Jeremiah 43:6, and from there by way of Spain to Ireland, where Zedekiah's daughter Tia Thefi was married to Jochided, the Heremon or chief king of Ireland. Jochided was a descendant of Zara, one of the twin sons of Judah, while David was a descendant of Pharez, the other twin. Killing all of Zedekiah's sons did not end the dynasty, as it was established law in Israel ever since they first entered Palestine, that when a man died leaving no sons, his daughters received the entire inheritance. The two king lines of the tribe of Judah were united in this marriage, and the lineage is clearly traced in the histories of Ireland, Scotland, and England, unbroken down to the present British Queen Elizabeth. Thus, the prophecy that David's descendants should always be on the throne over an Israelite nation has been fulfilled, and by the Anglo-Saxon nations only. This has covered but a tiny fraction of the biblical proof that the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Germanic people are the Israel of the Bible. Scholars have found nearly 100 prophecies concerning Israel which have been fulfilled by this one group of people. When you consider that the United Nations now recognizes over 100 member nations, the odds against any one nation fulfilling the first of these prophecies is obviously 100-1. The odds against the same nation fulfilling both the first and the second prophecies again multiplies by 100, making 10,000 to 1. And the odds against the same nation fulfilling the first, second, and third prophecies becomes 1,000,000 to 1. Well, you figure it out. Keep on multiplying by 100, or even 50 more times. But even that isn't all. A group of nations, all the same blood, have done this. Not a random assortment, like China and Spain, or Egypt and Brazil, but all of the same racial group. So this again multiplies the odds. Do you think that this could have happened by mere accident? And if you do think that this was pure accident, then what has become of God's prophecies and promises? Was he too ignorant to know that he couldn't make good on his word, that all the things he had promised to Israel never got there, but were all taken by other people? No, I don't think that God made any failures or any mistakes. He promised and prophesied many things about Israel. They have all come to pass, and they have all been made good to the same racial group of nations. This people has Israel's fingerprints. There is also the other line of proof of the identity of these people, by tracing historically their migration into Europe, and from there into their colonies. But that is another subject, much longer than the one we just covered. Who are the Jews? The identification of the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, Germanic peoples as the surviving members of the peoples of Israel leaves us with two other questions to answer. 1. Who are the Jews? And 2. Was Jesus Christ a Jew? To answer these questions, we must first define what we mean by Jew. The muddled thinking of most people on this subject is due to the fact that they never know just what they do mean by Jew. Sometimes they mean a Jew by religion, regardless of his race. For Negroes, Chinese, and Japanese have all been converted to Judaism. Or sometimes they mean a Jew by race, regardless of his religion. For example, Premier Ben Gurion of the Jewish nation in Palestine is a Buddhist by religion, though a Jew by race. And usually people don't know which of these they do mean. Since it can be answered quickest, let us first take the question, was Jesus Christ a Jew by religion? The answer is clearly no. Jesus had the true religion of the Old Testament, found in the Law and the Prophets, and he constantly rebuked the Jews for having abandoned this for Judaism under the Babylonian Talmud, which in his day was called the tradition of the elders. In Matthew 5-17-18, he said, quote, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till I am fulfilled." Unquote. Jesus constantly rebuked the Jews for their apostasy, for setting aside the laws of God in favor of the tradition of the elders. This Talmudic Judaism was very different from the religion which we find in the Old Testament. The late Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, Chief Rabbi of the United States, expressed it so clearly that I cannot improve on his words. He said, quote, "The return from Babylon and the adoption of the Babylonian Talmud marks the end of Hebrewism and the beginning of Judaism." Unquote. Since the true religion of the Old Testament was the religion of the real Hebrews, not Jews, the learned rabbi was quite right in calling it Hebrewism and noting that it came to its end when the Talmud, then called the tradition of the elders, was adopted, and this was the beginning of a new religion, Judaism, or Babylonianism. So we read in Matthew 15:1-9, quote, "Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. But he answered and said unto them, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? Ye hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoureth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men." Unquote. The same incident is found also in Mark 7 to 5:13. In John 5 to 37:46, Jesus told the Jews, "The Father himself, which hath sent me, hath borne witness of. Search the Scriptures, for in them ye think ye have eternal life, and it is they which testify of me. For had ye believed Moses, ye would have believed me, for he writeth of me." Again in John 8 to 54:55, Lie said, quote, "It is my Father that honored me, of whom ye say that he is your God, yet ye have not known him." Unquote. In John 15 to 23, Jesus said, "He that hateth me hateth my Father also." In the 21st chapter of Matthew, Jesus summed up their position by saying that even the tax collectors and the harlots could enter the kingdom of God before the Jews. Surely Jesus Christ's entire ministry was a complete demonstration that he was not a Jew by religion. Was Jesus a Jew by race? To answer this, we must trace the racial ancestry of both Jesus and the Jews. Jesus Christ was a pure-blooded member of the tribe of Judah, and no true Judahite was a Jew by race, as we shall see. Jesus' ancestry is given in both Matthew 1 and Luke 3. Both of them show that he was a descendant of the patriarch Judah, through one of his twin sons, Phares, by his mother Mary. He came through the line of David and Nathan, the brother of Solomon, as traced in the 3rd chapter of Luke. Jesus Christ was therefore a pure-blooded Israelite of the tribe of Judah, as Paul says in Romans 9 to 4:5. Now let us trace the racial descent of the Jews. First, let us note that the Jews were not and are not Israelites. Let us get the first proof of this from Jesus Christ himself. He stated plainly in Matthew 15 to 24, quote, "I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Unquote. Therefore, he was sent to those who were of Israel, but not to others. Accordingly, when he sent his 12 disciples out to preach his gospel, Matthew 10 to 5:6 records that he told them this, quote, "Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans. Enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Unquote. And he added, quote, "Ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come." Unquote. Matthew 10 to 23. They could have gone over all the cities of Judea in a month, so it was obvious that the cities of Israel to which he referred were not the cities of the so-called lost tribes, who had already entered Europe in their long migration. But take careful note of Jesus Christ's own words, "I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel." If the Jews were any part of Israel, then they would have been some of his sheep, but he says that they are not. In the 10th chapter of John, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd, I know my sheep, and I am known of mine." But he tells the Jews, and it says Jews, "But ye believe not, because ye are not of my sheep. As I said unto you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." Note carefully those words. He does not say that the reason that the Jews are not his sheep is that they don't believe, and that they could become his sheep just by changing their minds. To the contrary, he says that the reason they don't believe is that they are not of his sheep. He knows his sheep, and knows that the Jews are not of his sheep. Since the Jews are not any part of any tribe of Israel, then who are the Jews? Let's trace their ancestry. We find that the true line of his people must be kept free from mongrelization with the neighboring Canaanite. Accordingly, Genesis 24 to 3:4 records that Abraham took great pains to see that his son Isaac should marry of only a woman of his own people. Likewise, Genesis 27 to 46 and 28 to 1 records that Isaac also required that his son Jacob, the father of the Israelites, should also marry only within his own race line. This law had been obeyed for several centuries to keep the race line pure. But one of the sons of Israel, the patriarch Judah, father of the tribe of Judah, violated it by marrying a Canaanite woman who bore him 3 sons, of whom only one, Shelah, survived and left descendants. See Genesis 38 to 1 and 5. This half-breed mongrel line must be distinguished from Judah's pure-blood descendants by his twin sons Phares and Zara. Judah fathered Phares and Zara by his daughter-in-law Tamar. Although born out of wedlock, they were of pure Israel stock on both sides, and from one of them, Phares, Jesus Christ was descended. The descendants of these twins are the real tribe of Judah. The half-breed son Shelah, accompanied by Judah into Egypt, and in the following centuries left many descendants. They were in the Exodus and accompanied by the armies of Israel in the Promised Land. See Genesis 46 to 12 and Numbers 26 to 20. However, they bred true to the type. They were half-breed Canaanites, lacking the spiritual insight which God gave to his own people, so they remained idolaters, Baal worshippers. In the First Chronicles 4 to 21, you will find them referred to as the house of Ashbee. Ashbee is a corruption of Ishbal, man of Baal, and shows that they were still idolaters, unable to perceive the God of Israel. So these Shelenites, half-breeds, formed of one of the peoples of the land, who made up the Jews in the times of Jesus Christ. Another alien racial group who became part of the Jews were the mixed multitude, which Exodus 12 to 38 says left Egypt along with the children of Israel. The Hebrew word here translated mixed is the word Arab, meaning half-breed or mongrel. During the 2 centuries in Egypt, many had violated the divine law against race mixing, and these were the result. On the Exodus, when the going became hard in the wilderness, the Bible records that this mixed multitude made a lot of trouble and led some of the Israelites into rebellion. See Numbers 11 to 4-6. This mongrelized group was still in the land after the return from the Babylonian captivity, for we find them listed in Nehemiah 13 to 3 as still in the land and still a source of trouble. They also were among the Jews in Christ's time. Then there were the various Canaanite peoples who were still in the land, chief of whom were the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, and the Amorites. When the Israelites were about to enter the Promised Land, God gave them specific instructions to completely drive out or exterminate all of these Canaanites, saying, quote, "When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and had cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou, and when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show any mercy unto them. But of the cities of this people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive nothing that breedeth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them, namely, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee." Unquote. See Numbers 33 to 50-56, Deuteronomy 7 to 1-6, and 20 to 16-18. I know that it is fashionable among the liberal church members of today to look down their noses at God and say, I just can't believe in that cruel God of the Old Testament. However, I think he will manage very well without their belief. He always has a good reason for what he does or tells us to do. The Bible never argues with you about the reasons for its rules. It just states the rule. But there is always a good reason if you look for it. For about 2000 years, the Canaanites had worshipped Baal and Ishtar, the most immoral religion in the world, with the possible exception of some Hindu religions even today. Part of the worship of Baal and Ishtar consisted the compulsory prostitution of all the women. On certain festival days of the year, all the women of the village had to sit in the field outside the village gate, and any wandering camel driver who came along could select the woman of his choice, hand her the coin which he must pay over to the temple, then take her aside and leave her with his syphilis or gonorrhea, as the case might be. This funneled into Palestine the venereal diseases of all Western Asia. Any doctor can tell you that one infection of syphilis, not cured, can produce degenerative changes in the children for as many as 4 generations. But the Canaanites had been replenishing the disease with new infections every generation for 2000 years. They were not physically, mentally, morally, or spiritually fit to marry or even associate with our people. Therefore, God warned the Israelites to exterminate them. If you do not, he warned them, you will have integration. Your children will grow up with theirs as playmates. They will intermarry until you become as badly polluted as they are, and I will have to destroy you as I am commanding you to destroy them. But the Israelites are often soft-hearted and soft-headed. While they did not exterminate the people of Jericho and a couple of other cities, the Bible records that they left most of the others alive, merely making them pay a heavy tribute tax. For example, the city of Jerusalem was inhabited by the Jebusites at the time the Israelites came in. The Bible records that the Jebusites were neither killed nor driven out, but continued to live among the people of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. See Joshua 15-63 and Judges 1-21 and 27-35, and 19-10-12 and 2 Chronicles 8-7-8. Even after the people of the southern kingdom of Judah returned from the 70 years captivity in Babylon, the Jebusites were still in the land, and some of the people were intermarrying among them. See Ezra 9-1-2 and Nehemiah 13-23-29. And the Bible records that the same thing as to the other Canaanite peoples. Further proof of this is found in various places, such as Ezekiel 16-1-3. Quote, Again the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, cause Jerusalem to know her abominations, and say thus, said the Lord God unto Jerusalem, Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan, thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother a Hittite. Unquote. God could not have said this truthfully to any real Israelites, but he was not saying it to Israelites, he said it to the city of Jerusalem and her people. They were in large part Canaanite Jews, and they had gained power in the manner by which Jews usually gain it. Hence, Jerusalem was becoming more and more corrupt, as most of the prophets record. They surrounded and because the influential advisors of the kings of Judah, just as today they surround and are the principal advisors of our president. We find clear proof of this in Isaiah 3-8-9, where he says, quote, For Jerusalem is ruined, and Judah is fallen, because their tongues and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. The show of their countenance doth witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom, they hide it not. Woe unto their soul, aye, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. Unquote. Now in China, where their rulers were Chinese, you couldn't say that the show of their countenance doth witness against them. Their faces would be just like those of the rest of the Chinese. And in Sweden, where their ruling class were Swedes, you couldn't say that their faces were witness against them, for they had the same kind of Swedish faces as the rest of the people had. But in Jerusalem, the faces of the Canaanite, Jebusite Jews identified them, were a witness against them, quote unquote. The true Israelites were not hook-nosed. The ancient kings of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia were very vain about their military conquests and left carved stone monuments telling how they captured this city and that one, killed so many people and enslaved the others, etc. And on these monuments, they usually had carved in stone pictures of the captive people. Whenever they showed Israelites, the faces had straight noses and were generally of Anglo-Saxon type, but when they showed Canaanites, the faces were those of the typical hook-nosed Jews. Therefore, the faces of the Canaanite Jebusite Jews, who had gained controlling power as merchants, bankers, advisors of the king, the wealthy ruling class, identified them as separate from the real Israelites. The show of their countenance doth witness against them. They had brought ruin upon the kingdom of Judah. Now go back and read the many places where Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel condemned the wickedness which was found in Jerusalem. Don't you find the same conditions existing in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., where large numbers of the same people have gained power through their wealth? So we find that there were still large numbers of Canaanites in the land, integrated, quote unquote, with the real Israelites and Judahites, and bringing the lowering of standards, which integration always brings. Look at the city of Washington, D.C., for example. Besides the Jebusites in Jerusalem, the Bible records that the other Canaanite peoples, the Hittites, the Hivites, and the Perizzites, and the Amorites, were not exterminated or driven out, but merely conquered and made to pay a tribute tax and left in the land to be integrated with the people and corrupt them. So these Canaanites were another element of the Jews in the time of Jesus Christ. You will remember that when the people of Israel left Egypt, they were accompanied by a mixed mongrel multitude. The same is true of the return of the remnant of the people of Kingdom of Judah from their captivity in Babylon. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah records the return. They show that the total number of who returned was 42,360, but they also show that among these were many who were not Israelites of any tribe. They were Babylonians, who had come with them in order to get in on the ground floor, as the saying is, and they had even infiltrated into the priesthood. But it says that these sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found. When you add up the total of these other elements listed in Ezra and Nehemiah, they equal to 8,381 of these alien Babylonians, about 1/5 of all the people who returned from Babylon to Palestine. So they also formed another element of the Jews in the land of Jesus Christ's time. One more, and we complete the list, that is the Edomites. You will remember that Esau and Jacob were twin brothers. But Esau was a man of such low character that we have God's own testimony in Malachi 1-2-3. Quote, "Was not Esau Jacob's brother? Said the Lord. Yet I loved Jacob and hated Esau." Unquote. Jacob kept the race line pure, and God changed his name to Israel and made him the father of God's own chosen people, Israel. But Esau married 2 Canaanite wives and 1 Ishmaelite wife, and left only half-breed mongrel children. See Genesis 26-34, 35, and 27-46, and 36-2. As his mongrel descendants could not marry into the true Semitic line, he moved out from among them, and he went down to Mount Seir, the rugged range of mountains southeast of the Dead Sea, and this land was called Edom, or occasionally by the Grecianized form of the word Idumea. Thereafter, his descendants were called Edomites. See Genesis 36-16 and Genesis 36-1-9. There they had a long and troublesome history. Esau's grandson was Amalek, father of the tribe of Amalek, who were such an evil lot that in Exodus 17-14-16 God said that he would have perpetual war with Amalek until they were all destroyed. The Edomites constantly harassed the southern portion of Israel until King Saul beat them off about 1087 BC. But Saul disobeyed God's command to exterminate them, and for this disobedience God deposed him as king in favor of David. See 1 Samuel 15-1-26. But even David didn't exterminate them, and there was a long history of wars between Edom and Israel, later with Judah. You will find it in 2 Kings chapters 8 and 14, and 2 Chronicles chapters 20 and 25. The whole book of Obadiah is devoted to God's condemnation of Edom's treacherous attack upon the kingdom of Judah when Judah was being conquered by Babylon. During the Babylonian captivity of Judah, the land lay practically empty, and during this period, the people of Edom, partly from opportunity and partly from pressure against them from the east, moved into the vacant southern half of the old kingdom of Judah. From this new area, they continued to harass the little nation which returned from Babylon by about 142 BC. The returned exiles of Judah won complete independence under the Maccabean line of kings, and about 120 BC, John Hyrcanus of the Maccabean kings conquered the Edomites. He too, instead of exterminating them, took them into his kingdom, offering them full citizenship if they would give up their paganism and adopt the religion of Judaism. This they did, and from 120 BC they were full citizens of the kingdom. By 69 BC, incompetent leadership and intrigue within the Maccabean monarchy, together with the rising power of Rome in Western Asia, gave opportunity to Antipater, also called Antipas, an Edomite chieftain, founder of the Herodian family, to rise to power. By bribery, boldness, and military skill, he gained the favor of Rome, and the Romans made him procurator, governor, of Judea. His son, Herod I, beginning as governor of Galilee, used the same methods to secure appointment as king of Judea in 40 BC, and by 37 BC he had gained complete control of Judea. He maintained himself in power by extreme ruthlessness and by bribery, for which he taxed the people very heavily. This is the same Herod who had all the little male children in Bethlehem murdered, trying to murder Jesus Christ. His son Herod Archelaus held the governorship for 10 years of astonishingly evil misrule from 4 BC to 6 AD, after which the Romans convicted him of crimes and removed him, and thereafter Judea was governed by Roman procurators, of whom Pontius Pilate was number 6. Nevertheless, the Romans left practically complete power of local government in the hands of the Herodian Edomites, who had complete control of the temple and power to enforce all their local laws. Remember how Pontius Pilate tried to get out of condemning Jesus Christ, telling the Jews, "Take ye him and judge him according to your law." John 11-31. These Edomite Jews could say that Abraham was an ancestor of theirs through Esau, as they did in John 8-33. But this Hebrew blood through Esau had been diluted to the vanishing point by the 1,700 years of marrying only people of Canaanite racial stocks. Therefore, Jesus Christ rebuked them for falsely claiming to be still of the Abrahamic lineage. He told them in John 8-44, quote, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him." Unquote. You should very carefully observe the 8th chapter of John, verses 31-47. These were Jews to whom Jesus was speaking, and the Bible identifies them as Jews. In the Jewish Encyclopedia, the article on Edom concludes with the words, "The Edomites today are found in modern Jewry." Was Jesus Christ a Jew? Now, let us review for a moment what we have covered. We have seen that Jesus Christ was not a Jew by religion, for the Jews based their religion on the Babylonian Talmud, which was at the time called the tradition of the elders. And Jesus Christ's whole ministry was one constant battle against the evils of Judaism. We have seen that Jesus Christ was a true Israelite of the tribe of Judah by race, and we have seen that the Jews of his time included the mongrel descendants of Shelah, the mongrel mixed multitude which followed the Israelites out of Egypt, the various Canaanite peoples in Palestine, including the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, and the Amorites. Now, do you understand why Jesus Christ, who said that he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, told the Jews that I know my sheep, and they know me, but you, the Jews, believe not because you are not of my sheep. As I said unto you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. In the 10th chapter of John, the tiny remnant of Judah and Benjamin, which came back to Palestine from the Babylonian captivity, did leave some descendants in Palestine, but these were Jesus Christ's sheep, and he himself said he knew them, they knew him, and they followed him. All these in Palestine who became Christians were true members of the tribe of Judah or the tribe of Benjamin, but they were not Jews, and the Jews were not members of Judah, Benjamin, or any other Israelite tribe, for Jesus Christ himself said they were not of his sheep. Now we know who it was who constituted the Jews in Jesus Christ's time. If you want to bring it down to date and find out who are the Jews in our own day, we must add one more racial element. Of course, the descendants of the Jews of Jesus Christ's day are among them, but there is also another element, the Khazars. These make up the Slavic Jews of today. Meanwhile, we must return to the Jews of Palestine for a few words. As you know, by 68 AD, the Romans had found the rascality of the Palestinian Jews so intolerable that they began the campaign which resulted in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Jews were then expelled from Palestine, and most of them migrated in large numbers to what was then called Byzantium, later called Constantinople, and today is known as Istanbul, facing the Bosphorus outlet of the Black Sea. Here they again demonstrated the truth of the Bible's lesson, that conduct is the product of character, or in Jesus Christ's own words, "You are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do." By about the year 300 AD, their rascality had again become so intolerable that they were again expelled and they moved northeast into the Khazar kingdom. About the year 150 AD, the Khazars, an Asiatic people related to the Turks, migrated westward from Central Asia and established a great empire which covered what is today southwestern Russia, north of the Aral Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Black Sea, including the Don and Dnieper valleys in the Crimea. About 740 AD, Bulan, the Kagan or king of the Khazars, was converted to the religion of Judaism, together with some 4,000 of the most powerful nobility of the kingdom. In those days, it was not helpful for a subject to be in a religion in conflict with that of the king or with the baron on whose land he lived. So, in due course, most of the Khazars became Jews by religion. In fact, it became part of the kingdom's constitution that no one but a Jew by religion could be king. The principal languages spoken were the Khazar, called Yiddish today, and Turkish. During the Great Invasion by the Mongols under Genghis Khan, many of the Judaic Khazars were dispersed into what is now Poland and Lithuania. These Khazars, Jews by religion, constitute the Slavic Jews of today, those with names such as Minsky and Baranov and Moskowitz, the latter often shortened to Mosk. Also, since much of the western part of this area has been at one time or another ruled by Austrian or Germanic peoples who brought in their own language, these Khazars also took Germanic names such as Gold or Goldberg, Rosenberg, Eisler, and so forth. If you are wondering how they can be so much like the other Jews, historical documents written at the time the Khazar Empire was at its greatest height refer to their tradition that their ancestors originally came from the region of Mount Seir, which is Edom, the home of the Edomite Jews. If you wish to look up further details, you will find brief articles on the Khazars in various encyclopedias, such as the Britannica. The Jewish Encyclopedia has 6 pages on it. In some it's spelled Khazar, and in others Khazar, and even other variations. It is also discussed in A History of the Jews by Solomon Grazel and A History of the Jews by Prof. H. Graetz, both works being published by the Jewish Publication Society of America. The most thorough discussion of the whole problem is found in that magnificent bit of historical research, The Iron Curtain over America, by Colonel John Beatty. Colonel Beatty is a historian and a professor of history whose works are used as textbooks in more than 700 colleges and universities. Iron Curtain over America is one of the most thoroughly documented and accurate works ever put in print. It should be in the library of every patriotic American and good Christian. Perhaps you are wondering, why does my Bible sometimes speak well of the Jews, such as Paul saying in Romans that the gospel of Christ is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, and in Acts Paul saying that he was a Jew of Tarsus. If you will look up these few instances in a good concordance, such as Strong's, you will find that in each instance the translators have written the word Jew in English where it was not used in the original Greek, from which they mistranslated. In such instances, the original Greek, the word used was Judaios, which does not mean Jew, but simply a Judean, a person whose home is in the land of Judea or southern Palestine. It has no religious connotation, and it has no racial connotation either. It is purely a geographic term, like a Californian. A Californian could be white, black, brown, or yellow by race, and he could be Christian, Jew, Buddhist, or atheist. So also a Judaios was merely a person who lived in Judea, where, as we saw, there were some few Israelites of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, but there were so far more Canaanite Jews and also a general mixture of Romans, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, etc. It is true that Christian salvation was first offered in the land of Judea, hence to those who were living there, the Judaios, and later, as the apostles traveled from city to city, it was soon offered to the Greeks, but it was never offered to the Jews as a preferred class, for you will remember that Jesus Christ taught only in hard-to-understand parables when there were Jews around, and explained them privately to his disciples, explaining that he spoke among the Jews only in parables. lest at any time they should be converted, and their sins should be forgiven them. Both Matthew 13 to 10, 15 and Mark 4 to 10, 12 record this. Jesus was taking great pains to see that the Jews could not understand Christianity and be converted. He was preaching only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the members of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, which he said were his sheep, who knew his voice and followed him. The Jews he rejected as the children of their father the devil. Now to sum it up, the Jews are not and never were any part of any tribe of Israel. They include various mixtures of Egyptians, Babylonians, and Canaanites, the Edomites, and later the Xars. Christ was a pure-blooded Israelite of the tribe of Judah, without any Jewish ancestry, and he was not a Jew by religion. Now think this over carefully. The group of nations, which we loosely group under the term Anglo-Saxon, including the people of the British Isles, the Scandinavian nations, nearly all of Germany, Holland, and some few of the people of France and Belgium, with the closely related people found in Austria, some of the Swiss, Czech, some of the Hungarians, North Italians, and Spanish, and their descendants, now living in the United States, Canada, Australia, and South Africa, are the living descendants of the Israel of the Bible, blood brothers of our Savior Jesus Christ. If you are descendant from these, the true people of the book, the lost sheep of the house of Israel, accept gladly the salvation and leadership of your risen Savior and King, the Lord Jesus Christ. You are called as Israelite Christians to stand up for righteousness and decency in the home, the church, the community, the nation, and the world, as Jesus Christ directed, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. Don't you appreciate your ancestry, your salvation, and your calling? That truly is your heritage. Who are the Gentiles? It is unfortunate that most people have so many mistaken ideas about their religion, due largely to the many mistranslations of words in the commonly used King James Version of the Bible. One of these mistaken ideas is that most of the people of the United States and Western Europe, in fact, nearly all of the Christians in the world, are Gentiles. You hear many of them, even clergymen who should know better, say, "I'm just a Gentile, saved by grace." I think it is high time we learned something about one of the most misused words, Gentile. First, you might be surprised to know that there is no such word in the Bible, in its original languages. Oh yes, I know that you are now riffling the pages of your King James Version, looking for some of the many places you will find Gentile in it. But I said that there is no such word in the Bible in its original languages. The word was put into it by translators who changed the wording of the Bible centuries after the last book in the Bible was written. If you are a good Christian, you will surely agree with me that what the prophets originally wrote in the books, which make up our Bible, was inspired by God. It was correct as the prophets wrote it, but not one of them wrote in English, remember, because no such language as English existed until many centuries after the prophets lived. It was written in Hebrew, as to the Old Testament, and the New Testament was originally written in the language which Jesus Christ spoke, Aramaic, a Semitic dialect somewhat similar to, but not the same as, Hebrew. But Aramaic was not generally understood outside of the Western Asia, so when Christianity began to spread into southern and southeastern Europe, the New Testament had to be translated into a language which was widely used in Europe. Greek served this purpose nicely, for it was understood by well-educated men over nearly all of Europe. Therefore, the New Testament was first translated into Greek. Protestant English language translations of the Bible today are nearly all translated from Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament and Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. So, let's start at the beginning, with the Old Testament. The word Gentile is not even once used in any Hebrew manuscript of the Old Testament, for the good reason that there is no such word in Hebrew, nor any word which corresponds to it. Everywhere you find the word Gentile used in the Old Testament, it is a mistranslation of the Hebrew word goy, which means nation. The plural form of it is goim. Since it means nation, why didn't they translate it correctly? Sometimes they did, but for the most part they translated it to fit the original doctrines of the church of their day, no matter what violence that did to the true meaning of the word. The church hierarchy had long since determined what its doctrines should be, and if the Bible didn't agree with them, so much worse for the Bible. Men were still being burned at the stake for heresy in those days, and heresy meant any religious idea which differed from the official doctrines proclaimed by the bishops. So the translators did the best the church would allow them to. Let's take some examples. In Genesis 12:2, God said to Abram, quote, "I will make of thee a great nation." Unquote. In Hebrew, God said, quote, "I will make of thee a great goy." Unquote. It would have been too silly to translate this into, quote, "I will make a Gentile of you." Unquote. So they correctly translated it as nation. Again, Genesis 25-23. Rebekah was pregnant with the twins, Esau and Jacob, and while still in her womb, the unborn children were struggling against each other. So she wondered at this and asked God what was the meaning of this. God said to her, "Two goyim are in thy womb." Certainly God was not telling her, "You are an adulteress, pregnant with two Gentile children, when your husband is not a Gentile." God said, "Two nations are in thy womb," and that is the way it was translated, but it is the same word, goyim, which elsewhere they generally translate as Gentiles. Now let's take some examples from the New Testament. Here the word mistranslated Gentile is nearly always the Greek word ethnos, which means just exactly nation, the same as the Hebrew word goy. Luke 7 begins with the incident of a Roman centurion who appealed to Jesus Christ to heal his servant, who was sick unto death. The elders of the Jews praised him to Jesus, saying, "He loveth our ethnos, and hath built us a synagogue." These Jews would never praise anyone for loving the Gentiles, and the centurion would not have built a synagogue for Gentiles. So, to avoid complete absurdity, the translators were forced to translate ethnos correctly as nation. Again, in John 11-50, we find that the Jewish high priest, Caiaphas, was plotting with the chief priests and the Pharisees to murder Jesus Christ, and Caiaphas told them, quote, "It is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole ethnos perish not." Unquote. Nothing could have pleased this evil Jew more than for all the Gentiles to perish, using the word Gentile as we do today. Therefore, the translators had to translate ethnos correctly as nation. Yet in many other places they mistranslated Gentile. The Greek word ethnos means simply nation, nothing more or less. It has no pagan or non-Israel or even non-Greek connotation. The Greeks distinguished between Greeks and all non-Greek peoples whom they called barbarians. All educated men of the day knew this, and the Apostle Paul was a very well-educated man who was quite familiar with the Greek language and its idioms. He recognized this distinction in Romans 1-14, where he said, "I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians." Paul, therefore, never wrote the word Gentile in any of his epistles. What does the word Gentile mean, and from what is it derived? It is derived from the Latin word gentilis, which means one who is not a Roman citizen. If you use the word correctly, then you would have to say that Jesus Christ and his 12 disciples were all Gentiles, because none of them was a Roman citizen. Only Paul could say that he was not a Gentile, because in the 22nd chapter of Acts, Paul says that he was a Roman citizen by birth. How then is it used at present when the speaker means to say that someone is non-Jewish? About the 4th century AD, its use was loosely extended to cover more than its original meaning. It was applied especially to those who were heathen, pagan. It became a term for those who were neither Christian nor Jewish, for Christians and Jews were generally called just that, Christian or Jew. But this was centuries after the last book in the New Testament had been written. The word Gentile was never used by the writer of any book of the Old Testament because none of them had ever heard it, as they had never come in contact with Rome. It was not used by the writer of any book of the New Testament, for there is no such word in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek languages. They did not borrow the word from the Latin, for if you will look up every place it is used in your King James Version, you will see that it is never used in the correct sense, to say that someone is not a Roman citizen, and that is the only meaning it had, the only way anybody used it in those days. It was put in by the translators in an effort to make the Bible say what the translators thought it should have said. Therefore, it has no authority at all. In short, wherever you see the word Gentile in the Bible, remember that the correct word is nation, race, or people. Sometimes it is used when speaking of Israel nations or the Israelite race, as we have seen in the examples I have given you in the other instances. The context will show that it is being used of a nation which is non-Israelite. Only the context in which it is used will show you which meaning to give it. When used of non-Israelite race, perhaps Gentile is as good a word as any, for we seem to have no other in general use. But never be deceived by reading the word Gentile in your Bible, for its only correct meaning is nation or race. Suppose we are Israel. What difference does it make? What would you say to me or of me if you knew I had discovered that I was the heir to vast estates, great wealth, power and responsibility, and that instead of rejoicing in the great privilege and turning to the work with all its great issues, I simply said, well, and what if I'm the heir? What difference does it make? I know what you'd think, even if you didn't say it. Yet, when we show from the Bible and from history and archaeology that the Anglo-Saxon and kindred peoples are the modern descendants of the house of Israel, to whom God has pledged with his oath so many great privileges and blessings, many say indifferently, what difference does it make? They want only personal salvation. Now the man who has the blessing of personal salvation is the recipient of a marvelous gift of God in Jesus Christ, but that doesn't warrant his despising and rejecting the other God-given birthright, the birthright of race. The Bible, as given by God, is a complete whole. It stands or falls in one piece. It declares the whole counsel of God, and it required nothing short of the whole book to declare it. Otherwise, much of it would not have been written. It is not for man to go through the book, sorting and picking, deciding what he wishes to accept, and then say about the rest, what difference does it make? To do so is the height of presumption. God, in his wisdom, chose Israel to be used by him in his great plan for the transformation of a lost world. He wrote a large portion of the Bible to tell us about Israel's part in that plan, allowing ample space in the Bible for the presentation of the gospel to the individual. God wrote about 5/7 of the book as his message to the nations, and related to almost every phase of this revelation is the great nation Israel, promised by God to Abraham. Infidel critics are busy all the time knifing the scriptures, cutting out a bit here and a bit there, but the what difference does it make, folks, throw away 5/7 of the Bible in one lump. 5/7 is a lot of Bible to scrap. Actually, the Israel truth is the key which opens up the Bible from the first promise made at the fall until Jesus delivers up the finished kingdom to the Father. It may be likened to a spiritual thread which runs through almost every chapter of Bible history, every doctrine, symbol, promise, and covenant. The thread which, when found, makes possible the unraveling of most of the mysteries of the world. This is why the people who see this truth have declared the Bible to be a new book, consistent, harmonious, and satisfying to mind and soul. Centuries ago, God made an unconditional, irrevocable covenant with Abraham to increase and preserve his posterity throughout all generations. And now, here we are, the many nations of Israel, right here on the planet after almost 4,000 years, doing the work he said Israel would do. Psalm 105:8 says, quote, "He remembers his covenant forever, the word he has commanded, through 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham and his oath to Isaac, for he confirmed it to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an eternal covenant." Unquote. The writers of the four Gospels constantly call attention to God's faithfulness to Abraham. The apostles, every one of them, gloried in it. But you say, what difference does it make? It made quite a difference to Esau, who despised his birthright of race. Afterwards, he found no place for repentance, though he sought it with tears. The birthright of race made quite a difference to Ishmael, the son of the bondwoman Hagar. The birthright of race also made quite a difference to the son of Keturah. Suppose we are Israel. Then we are the descendants of Abraham through Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob. There is a world of difference in the blessings of race, country, enlightenment, and opportunity bestowed upon the descendants of these than that which was bestowed upon the others. Does the fact that a man is saved eternally preclude the possibility of his appreciating the civil blessings which he enjoys under the Abrahamic covenant in these Israel countries? A short stay in the lands of the dictators would show the difference and be quite convincing. In Isaiah 51:2, God says, "Hearken to me, ye that follow after the righteousness, ye that seek the Lord. Look unto the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged. Look unto Abraham your father, and unto Sarah, that bare you, for I called him alone, and blessed him, and increased him." Ye that follow after righteousness are certainly the Christians, and we see that God wants them to see that they are Abraham's seed. In Genesis 17:7, God says, "I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee." Can it be possible that it means nothing to the believer to be chosen of God as an heir of that covenant, which in all of its ramifications God unfolds through the remainder of the scriptures? Suppose we are Israel. Then we are members of the kingdom of God on earth. He established that kingdom at Sinai. Constituting that kingdom was 12-tribed Israel. Matthew 21-43 tells us plainly that he took the kingdom from the Jews and turned it over to a nation. The Greek word is ethnos. Don't tell me it was given to a church, for the Greek word for church is ecclesia. That nation was to bring forth the fruits of the kingdom. Those fruits are both political and religious. True to Christ's assignment, the Israel nations led the world in evangelistic work, missionary work, Bible translation, publication, and distribution. The United States and the British Commonwealth holds the record for 90% of this work. It is not good Bible Christianity to hug the covenant of grace so close to our heart, and that we have no room for God's covenant of race. That spurns the honors conferred by God. It does not require much research to find many texts in which God reveals the exalted position given to his chosen race. A few of them are, quote, "But now thus said the Lord that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel, for I have redeemed thee, I have called thee by thy name, thou art mine. Since thou wast precious in my sight, thou hast been honorable, and I have loved thee." Unquote. Isaiah 43:1-4. Quote, "Thou didst separate them from among all the people of the earth to be thine inheritance." Unquote. 1 Kings 8-53. Quote, "For the Lord hath chosen Jacob unto himself, and Israel for a peculiar treasure." Unquote. Psalm 135-4. Quote, "For thou art a holy people," meaning set apart. "The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto himself above all the nations that are upon earth." Unquote. Deuteronomy 7-6. Note the honors conferred. He chose them, redeemed them, claimed them for his own, separated them, calls them precious, his peculiar treasure, his special people, his inheritance above all the peoples on earth. Think of any believer reading all of that and then turning upon his heel and saying, "Suppose we are Israel, what difference does it make?" It rejects God's comfort for the last days. God was anxious that his Israel people should have a clear vision of all that was to come to pass in these trying times, and consequently sent prophet after prophet telling of world conditions which we would experience in our day. But right along with the cataclysmic upheavals foretold, there is always a word of cheer, consolation, and encouragement to his people Israel. He wanted us to have the benefit of knowing what he is doing in the world, what the world events actually mean, how he is going to make it all work out to the good of his people Israel, and through all that is happening, bring in the kingdom of God on earth. The kingdom of God on earth is the one theme in the Bible. It is the theme Jesus preached in Romans 15-8. Paul tells us that Jesus Christ came to confirm the promises made unto the fathers. What is the worth of our identity with Israel? It proves God to be unchangeably faithful. It proves the Bible to be literally and historically true. It proves that God is working today, as the prophets have all foretold he would, in and through and for his people Israel, who are the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Germanic peoples. Lastly, but by no means least, it proves that Jesus Christ did what he came to do, confirm the promises made to the fathers. Historic proof of Israel's migrations. In my lecture called Israel's Fingerprints, I have sketched briefly for you some of the Bible's evidence that the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Germanic people of today are the living descendants of the Israel of the Bible. This evidence was in the form of many Bible prophecies of Israel's future, which have been accurately fulfilled by these nations and by no others. If the people who actually done all the things which God said Israel would do, and who have received the exact blessings which God said he would give to Israel, if they are not Israel, how could God be so greatly mistaken? No, God was not mistaken. He knew what he would do, and for whom he would do it, and by making good all his prophecies and promises, he has identified these nations as Israel. But there are some people who won't believe God and will not accept his identification of these nations. In fact, one clergyman with whom I discussed this, minister of a church in this county, wrote to me demanding to know what other historians of the time, in what books, chapters, and verses record their immigration into Northern and Western Europe and the British Isles. He is but one of many skeptics who ask this. And to these skeptics, the answer is yes, various historians of those centuries have traced various steps of this migration. What I propose to do for you now is to trace this migration historically. Remember that, within the time limits which we must necessarily be fixed on such a talk as this, I can only hit the high spots. You know how large a library can be filled with history books, so I can't quote them all verbatim, but I will have time enough to show you that the historians have traced this migration from Israel's old Palestinian home into their European homes as the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Germanic peoples. Not under their old names, of course, but that also is the fulfillment of God's prophecy that he would, quote, call his servants by another name, unquote. And surely you now know that the Bible identifies Israel and only Israel as God's servants. The migration of the Israelites covered about 12 centuries, during which time they were mentioned by various historians writing in different languages during different centuries, and therefore mentioned under different names. Even today, if you were to read a London newspaper, a Paris newspaper, and a Berlin newspaper, all dated about the end of 1940, you would find that the British newspaper said that in the year France was invaded by the Germans, the French newspaper said that the invasion was by les Allemands, and that the German newspaper said that the invasion was by the Deutsch. Yet all three were talking about the same people in the same invasion. Likewise, we must not be surprised to find the Israelites were given different names in the Assyrian, Greek, and Latin languages. Likewise, even in the same language, names change from century to century, just as today we never speak of Bohemia, as it was called only a century ago, but only of Czechoslovakia. You remember that the original 12-tribe nation of Israel broke up into two nations, and upon the death of King Solomon, about 975 BC, the northern two-thirds of the land, containing 10 tribes, kept the name Israel, while the southern one-third, containing the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, with many of the Levites, took the name of Judah, after the royal tribe. From that time on, they kept their separate existence until they were finally merged into a vast migration, as we will see. Most of the kings of the 10-tribed northern kingdom of Israel were distinguished more for their wickedness than for any ability. However, Omri, who reigned from 885 to 874 BC, was a vigorous and able king, although as wicked as the others, and his reign was regarded among the other nations of Western Asia as the foundation upon which the national identity thereafter rested. The languages of the day spoke of a family, a tribe, or even a whole nation as the house or household. If you have read your Bible much, you must surely remember God's many references to the house of Israel or house of Judah, meaning, in each case, the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of Judah, but the phrase was also used in those days to refer to a nation as the house of a great king who ruled it. The Assyrians, among others, began calling the 12-tribed kingdom of Israel the house of Omri. In Hebrew, a house was a bahith or a beit. In English, usually spelled Beth and pronounced Beth. In the related Semitic language of Assyrian, this was Bit. The Hebrew Omri was in Assyrian sometimes written Humri, sometimes Kumri. With this preface in mind, let's start tracing the Israelites from their Palestinian homeland in the Assyrian conquest and deportation. In 2 Kings 15-29 we read, In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon and Bel-Beth-Machach, and Janoah, and Kedesh, and Razor, and Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. In the First Chronicles 5-26 it says, And the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he carried them away, even the Reubenites, and the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh, and brought them unto Hala, and Habor, and Hara, and to the river Gozan, unto this day. Confirmation of this is found in inscriptions of Tiglath-Pileser, which archaeologists have dug up and are in our museums today. One of these says, "The cities of Gaza, probably Assyrian for Galilee, Abilka, probably Assyrian for Abel-Beth, Makkah, which are on the border of Beth Humna, the whole land of Naphtali in its entirety, I brought within the border of Assyria. My official I set over them as a governor. The land of Beth Humna, all of its people, together with all their gods, I carried off to Assyria. Pahaka, their king, they deposed, and I placed Ossi as king." In confirmation of this change of kings, we read in 2 Kings 15-30, "And Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekar, the son of Remaliah, and smote him, and slew him, and reigned in his stead." The conquest thus began in the northeastern and northern parts of the kingdom, about 740 BC, worked southward down to the heavily fortified capital city of Samaria, which was captured about 721 BC. Another king of Assyria reigned by that time. 2 Kings 18-9-11 records it as follows. "And it came to pass in the 4th year of King Hezekiah of Judah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And at the end of 3 years they took it, even in the 6th year of Hezekiah, that is, the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. Samaria was taken, and the king of Assyria did carry away Israel unto Assyria, and put them in Hala, and in harbor by the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes." We know that King Shalmaneser died toward the latter part of this siege, and the final conquest and deportation were carried on by his successor, King Sargon II. In confirmation of this, an inscription of Sargon II says, quote, "In the beginning of my reign, the city of Samaria I besieged, I captured. The 27,280 of its inhabitants I carried away." Unquote. The deportation of a whole nation naturally took a considerable period of time. The journey had to be organized, with adequate supplies for each convoy on each stage of the journey, and proper organization of the places selected to receive them. We know that Sargon II did not hold the cities of Medes east of the Zagros mountains until a few years after 721 BC, so about 715 to 712 BC is the correct date for the deportation to Media. The places to which Israel was deported by the Assyrians can be summed up in brief as constituting an arc or semicircle around the southern end of the Caspian Sea. This deportation took in the entire population of the 10 northern tribes constituting the nation of Israel. From this point on, the separation into tribes is apparently lost, and it is as a nation that the kingdom of Israel moved into the Assyrian captivity. This left the other 2 tribes still living in the southern kingdom of Judah. Assyria and Egypt were the 2 giant empires of that day, each seeking dominion over all the smaller and weaker nations. Assyria had driven Egyptian influence out of Western Asia back to the continent of Africa, and had made all the smaller nations surrounding Judah into vassal states, paying heavy tribute to Assyria. The brutal, arid, rapacious character of the Assyrians made them no friends, and their vassal states were always hopefully looking for any means of escape from Assyrian power. Egypt kept the hope of revolt alive by offers of military assistance to those who would rebel against Assyria. The death of a king seemed the most opportune time for revolt, since his successor would need time to get his power organized and might even face some competition at home for his throne. Therefore, when King Sargon II of Assyria died about 705 BC, revolts began in Western Asia, the Kingdom of Judah, under King Hezekiah, taking part in it in the hope of military aid from Egypt, although the prophet Isaiah warned that the revolt would fail. The new king of Assyria, Sennacherib, set about recovering his empire. One rebellious city after another was reconquered, with the hideous cruelty characteristic of Assyria. And in 701 BC, Sennacherib's huge army invaded the kingdom of Judah. Midway through it, they paused briefly to defeat the Egyptian army, then moved on to besiege Jerusalem. None of the smaller cities of Judah were able to resist. 2 Kings 18-13 and Isaiah 36-1 say that, quote, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them, unquote. Then followed the siege of Jerusalem, which was ended when the angel of the Lord killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night, and Sennacherib gave up the siege and fled back to his own land. In confirmation of this, says, quote, I then besieged Hezekiah of Judah, who had not submitted to my yoke, and I captured 46 of his strong cities and fortresses, and innumerable small cities which were round about them. With the battering of rams and the assault of engines, and the attack of foot soldiers, and by mines and breaches made in the walls, I brought out therefrom 200,150 people, both small and great. Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up within Jerusalem, his royal city. Unquote. Ancient kings were boastful of their victories, but never of their defeats. So King Sennacherib tactfully fails to state how the siege of Jerusalem ended, but he does confirm the capture of all the other cities of Judah and the deportation therefrom of 200,150 people. Remember that all the people of the 10 northern tribes were already settled around the south end of the Caspian Sea in the Assyrian deportation of Israel. Now to them was added a large portion of the 2 southern tribes of Benjamin and Judah, so that the Assyrian deportation included all of the 10 tribes and a substantial representation from the other 2. These were the people who became your ancestors and mine, who then moved into Europe. Over the years, the increasing numbers of the Israelite tribes expanded northward along both sides of the Caspian Sea. They were not basically city builders, but farmers and herdsmen. Probably in the earlier part of their stay there, the Assyrians sternly discouraged the building of cities, which would naturally be fortified centers of resistance. As they were moved into this area, herded along as prisoners, robbed of all their belongings, they had to make themselves brush shelters or booths, where they stopped for any length of time. Here in the southwest, our Indians call such a brush shelter a wickiup. The Hebrews called it a sukkah, applying the name also to a tent. It was the only house a nomad owned. The plural of sokau was sukkoth. Gradually, this was slurred over into skuth, used of a tent-dweller or nomad, and finally became Scythian. The great carving on the Behistun rock, made about 516 BC, carried inscriptions showing the many different nations who were tributary to King Darius I of Persia. These inscriptions were written in Old Persian, in Median, and Assyrian. They showed that among these were a Scythian nation called in Assyrian and Babylonian Gimiri, which means the tribes. From Gimiri was derived the name of the Cimmerians, who settled somewhat to the north and into the Ukraine. But the Behistun inscriptions also stated that these people were called Saka in Persian and Median. Already the later names are beginning to evolve. The great Greek historian Herodotus, who lived from 484 to 425 BC, and who is generally called the father of history, speaking of these people, says, "The Sakae, or Scyths, were clad in trousers and had on their heads tall, stiff caps rising to a point. They bore the bow of their country and a dagger, besides which they carried the battle axe or sagaris. They were in truth Amerindian Scythians, but the Persians call them Sakai, since that is the name which they give to all Scythians." Incidentally, some of the magnificent carved walls of the ancient ruins of the Persian palace at Persepolis show illustrations of those Sakai in their trousers and pointed caps, bringing tribute to the Persian king. We are now getting further clues to these people. Herodotus says that the Scythians, or Sakai, first appeared in that land in the 7th century BC, which is the same period in which the tribes of Israel were settled there by their Assyrian conquerors. Their use of the battle axe as a weapon carries over from their history as Israel. In Jeremiah 51-20, God says of Israel, "Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war, for with thee I will break in pieces the nations, and with thee I will destroy kingdoms." We will see later that the name evolved from Sake to Saxon, and it is noteworthy that the battle axe was the great weapon of the Saxons. These Scythians, or Sakai, lived up to God's description of Israel as his battle axe and weapons of war. They became a military people of great power who did much to break up ancient nations. The Greek geographer and historian Strabo, who lived between 63 BC and about 21 AD, says, "Most of the Scythians beginning from the Caspian Sea are called Dahe Scythae, and those situated more towards the east, Masagatae and Sakae. The rest have the common name of Scythians, but each tribe has its own peculiar name. The Sakae had made incursions similar to those of the Simenans and Trerers, some near their own country, others at a great distance. They occupied Bactriana and got possession of the most fertile tract in Armenia, which was called after their own name, Sakasene. They advanced even as far as the Cappadocians, those particularly situated near the Euxine Sea, today called the Black Sea, who are now called Pontici. This was but the early part of their expansion, however. When a century had elapsed since their deportation to this land of Scythia, they had grown strong enough to begin the long series of harassing wars against their conquerors, the Assyrians. They lacked the strength to capture the powerfully fortified group of cities about the Assyrian capital, and in turn their nomadic habits made it easy for them to retreat before a too powerful Assyrian army. But generations of this constant warfare wore down the Assyrians, bled them white, so that when the Medes finally overran Assyria and captured Nineveh in 612, their victory was a fairly easy one against the exhausted Assyrians. From this point on, I could refer you to just one historical work which fully traces the Scythians onto their settlement in England as the Anglo-Saxons. A History of the Anglo-Saxon by Sharon Turner does a magnificent job of this. As most of you know, I am a lawyer by profession, and a lawyer soon learns to distinguish between the man who actually knows the facts and the man who is merely repeating hearsay, that is, gossip, and rumor he has heard from others. And how do we know whether these others actually know what they are talking about? Unless a man has seen the occurrence with his own eyes, his ideas on the subject are no better than the accuracy of the information he has received. Now, no historian living in our times can have any personal knowledge of what happened 2000 years ago, so his writings can be no better than the source material he has obtained from people who lived and wrote at a time when accurate information could still be had. Most modern history books are based on rather scanty documentation from many sources, as it is much easier for one historian to copy from another. But Sharon Turner's History of the Anglo-Saxons is one of the most thoroughly documented historical studies ever produced, and its reliability is beyond question. He traces the Anglo-Saxon of Britain back to the Scythians. Unfortunately, he doesn't go the one step further and trace the Scythians back to Israel, but we can do that from other sources. Let us go back to the Scythians, as the people of Israel became known in the land to which they were deported. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who was lived in the times of Julius and Augustus Caesar, says this, quote, "The Scythians anciently enjoyed but a small tract of ground, but, through their valor, growing stronger by degrees, they enlarged their dominion far and near, and attained at last to a vast and glorious empire. At the first, a very few of them, and those very despicable for their mean origin, seated themselves near to the river Araxes. Afterwards, one of their ancient kings, who was a warlike prince and skillful in arms, gained to their country all the mountainous parts as far as to the Mount Caucasus. Sometime afterwards, their posterity, becoming famous and eminent for valor and martial affairs, subdued many territories. Then, turning their arms the other way, they led their forces as far as to the river Nile in Egypt. Other historians record that blonde Scythians made an expedition against Palestine and Egypt about 626 BC. The town of Scythopholis in the Jordan Valley is named for a settlement made on this raid. But to continue with Diodorus Siculus, he says, "This nation prospered more and more, and had kings that were very famous, from whom the Sacans and the Massagetae and the Armespians, and many others called by other names, derived their origin." Among others, there were two remarkable colonies that were drawn out of the conquered nations by those kings. The one they brought out of Assyria and settled in the country lying between Paphlagonia and Pontus, the other out of Media, which they placed near the river Tanai, which people are called Soromatians. Note how God's destinies for these people worked. They would not leave behind any pockets of their people in the lands where their conquerors had settled them, but when they had gained great power, they came back and picked up any who remained, taking them into the migrating mass. Likewise, history records that they raided Babylon after its overthrow by the Medes and Persians, carrying off with them such of the people of Judah and Benjamin as were not going back to Jerusalem. Even in early times, before the final mass movement into Europe, the Scythians had begun their march to their new homelands, where some of them had already arrived before the beginning of the Christian era. Pliny the Elder, a Roman historian who lived from 23 to 79 AD, says this, "The name Scythian has extended in every direction, even to the Sarmatei and the Germans, but this ancient name is now only given to those who dwell beyond those nations, and live unknown to nearly all the rest of the world. Beyond the Danube are the peoples of Scythia. The Persians have called them by their general name of Sakae, which properly belongs to the nearest nation of them. The more ancient writers give them the name of Arameans. The multitude of these Scythians is quite innumerable. In their life and their habits, they much resemble the people of Parthia, Persia. The tribes among them that are better known are the Sakae, the Massagetae, the Dahae, etc. Others have noted this early migration into Germany. For example, Herodotus mentions a migration and settlement of a people he calls the Siginoe, who themselves claimed to be colonists from Media and who migrated as far as the river Rhine. Remember that among the places the Israelites were resettled were the cities of the Medes. Also note that Pliny the Elder said the more ancient writers gave them the name of Arami, that is, Aramean, in modern language called Syrian. In Deuteronomy 26:5, every Israelite was commanded to confess and sojourned there with a few, and became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. Hence, such ancient writers could correctly identify the Israelite Scythians as Arameans, for they had come from a land which was part of Syria. Among the tribes of the Scythians, the Massagetae attracted the notice of all the ancient historians by their numbers and warlike ability. Those who described them in more detail divided them into the Massagetae and the Disegatae. The Gatae part of the name soon evolved into Goth. The Massagetae were the greater Goths, and the Disegatae were the lesser Goths. Thus, we already find among the Scythians names we can identify as the people who later conducted the great migrations into Europe. The Goths, as we know, were later called Ostrogoths, meaning East Goths, and Visigoths, meaning West Goths. But to go back a few centuries, the Sacae were allies of the Medes and Persians in the attack upon Babylon in 536 BC. Remember that God had said that Israel was my battle axe and weapons of war, for with thee I will break in pieces the nations, and with thee I will destroy kingdoms. So God had used Scythian Israel to maintain a constant war against Assyria for nearly a century, until Assyria was too weakened to resist the Medes and Persians. Then God used Scythian Israel, the Sacae, to help in the conquest of Babylon, when its time had come. Later, King Cyrus of Persia was foolish enough to try to conquer his former allies, the Sacae, but he was killed in the battle. King Darius also tried to conquer them, but they, being a nomadic people, retreated before his massive armies until he gave up and retired. Professor George Rawlinson says that the original development of the Indo-European language took place in Armenia, which, you will remember, was at that time occupied by Scythian Israel. Certainly from these people we can trace the introduction of this language into Europe. This powerful and increasingly numerous people thereafter spread further north, both east and west of the Caspian Sea. To the west of it, they penetrated into the Volga and Don River valleys as the Soromatians and the royal Scythes, nomadic peoples. To reach these lands, they had to come up through the Caucasus Mountains by a great pass, which is today occupied by the Georgian military road. Perhaps the communists have changed the name of this pass in recent years, but from ancient times until within our own lifetimes, this pass was known as the Pass of Israel. The white race of Europe is often called Caucasian because the ancestors of many of them did thus come out of the Caucasus Mountains. When Alexander the Great began his great marauding expedition across Western Asia and as far as India, he had to skirt the edge of the lands held by the Scythians. In his limitless vanity and ambition, he wanted also to conquer them, but it is recorded that their ambassadors said that they would never surrender to him, that they were nomadic peoples who, if they could not resist, could retreat indefinitely before his armies, and they had no wealthy cities for him to occupy and loot. Alexander invaded their lands long enough to fight one severe battle with them, defeating the Scythian forces he met, but this was evidently just a lesson to them not to attack the flanks of his forces, for he led his forces out of their territory and never returned to attack. Remember that Israel is God's battle axe and weapons of war. They had already weakened Assyria, and as allies of the Medes and Persians had helped overthrow Assyria and Babylon. They had beaten off attempts of the Persians to conquer them, In the article Scythians, Chambers Encyclopedia, 1927, records that the Scythians, after about 128 BC, overran Persia, routed several Persian armies, and levied tribute from the Persian kings. During the 1st century before and the 1st century after Christ, hordes of Scythians, having overthrown the Bactrian and Indo-Greek dynasties of Afghanistan and India, invaded northern India, and there they maintained themselves with varying fortune for 5 centuries longer. The Jats of India and the Rajputs have both been assigned the Scythian ancestry. Madison Grant writes that ancient Bactria maintained its Nordic and Aryan aspect long after Alexander's time and did not become Mongolized and receive the sinister name of Turkestan until the 7th century AD. The Saka were the blond peoples who carried the Aryan language to India. A land so vast and not the original home of the Israelite Scythians, but already having some inhabitants when they settled there, must of course show varying types of people. The Nordic or Aryan Israelite Scythians conquered these other races, while some speak of a Mongoloid type found in some parts of Scythia. Ancient writers pretty well agree that the dominant Saka or Massagetae Scythians were a Nordic people. Dr. Hans Gunther, professor at Berlin University, in his Racial Elements of European History, published in 1920, says, quote, "The investigations into the traces left behind them by that widespread Nordic people, the Sakae, with its many tribes, are well worthy of attention. It had been living on the steppes of the southern Europe and spread as far as Turkestan and Magnestan, and even to the Indus. The ancient writers, such as Polemon of Ilium, Gallienus, Clement of Alexandria, and Adamantius, state that the Sakae were like the Celts and Germans, and describe them as a ruddy fair. The Scythian tribe of the Alans are also described as having a Nordic appearance. Ammianus, about 330–400 AD, calls them almost all tall and handsome, with hair almost yellow, and a fierce look. We have seen that the names of the Massagetae and the Thisagetae evolved into Goths and Ostrogoths, or East Goths and Visigoths. The historian Ptolemy, who died about 150 AD, mentions a Scythian people, descendant from the Sakae, by the name of Saxons, who had come from Media. Albinus, who lived in the 1st century BC, also says the Saxons were descended from the ancient Sakae in Asia, and in process of time they came to be called Saxons. Prideaux reports that the Cimbrians came from between the Black and Caspian Seas, and that with them came the Angli. We are now well into established European history. By the beginning of the 4th century AD, many of the Goths were already Christians. In the 4th century, there were several collisions between Visigoths and Rome, and in the 410, the Visigoths became the masters of Italy and captured Rome. Later, they moved on into southern France and northern Spain, where they settled permanently. The Ostrogoths settled in what is modern Hungary. About 455 AD, under Theodoric the Great, they conquered Italy about 493 and set up an Ostrogoth kingdom in Italy, which, however, was short-lived. Their descendants are the fair-skinned and blonde Italians of northern Italy. But the Goths had ended the Roman Empire. God's battle axe again destroying the kingdoms of the Babylonian order of empires. The Angli and the Saxons moved up the Danube valley and settled in Germany, along the Baltic shores, as is well known, and from there the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons colonized England after the Roman legions were withdrawn in 408 AD. Actually, the earliest waves of migration penetrated to the farthest edges of the European continent, partly because they could move through nearly empty lands, without meeting any peoples strong enough to effectively resist them, partly because they were pushed further by the later waves of Israelite migration coming behind them. Hence, we find the settlement of the Scandinavian peninsula pretty well completed before the arrival of the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons along the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. The tribes which settled along the shore of the Baltic Sea were a great maritime people, as some of the Israelites have been even when still in Palestine, and as God had prophesied. The Jutes, Angles, and Saxons came from within the Baltic Sea, but their ocean-borne raids on England were heavy and continuous. Later, by invitation of the British, they settled along the eastern shores, in East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, and Kent. William the Conqueror invaded England in 1056 with the Normans. They were actually Norse Vikings who had settled on the coast of France in the province of Normandy, Norman being really derived from Norseman. So we see that the migrations of Israel, first into Scythia, expanding there, then gaining the names of Goths, Angli, and Saxons, and under those names moving into the present European homelands, is a well-established historical fact. There is also the fascinating story of the early migrations by sea, but that is another subject in itself. The end.